Welcome to 30 on a Friday, as always. But I'm joined this morning by a different guest. This is Alison. Alison, welcome.
Hi, thanks, Ant. Morning, everyone. Yeah, good to be here on a Friday, and the sun's out, so it's even better.
I'm glad the sun's out with you. It is here, but it is very cold. I've kind of been sat here wanting to put my coat on for.
Yep, the first frost. Great to have you with us.
It's great to have you with us, and thank you for joining. It's always good, and as everyone who's watched this before, but if you haven't watched it before, we're always trying to get different guests on, get different perspectives on all of the goings on that happen. We're always talking about hot topics that have happened this week, what's been going on in the world, what are we hearing from clients and from clients around the world, what are the hot topics, what are people really struggling with in the moment at work at the moment, and can we share some practical hints and tips, maybe understand what's been going on for people, and get some different perspectives from different people. So Alison, I'm really pleased to have you with us. Do you want to just explain just what you do and who you are a little bit more?
Okay, thanks, Ant. Yes, so I guess I'll start with my background is mainly in hospitality and retail industries, where I started my career, I guess, as a manager in those businesses and then specialised in learning and development, where I've spent about 25-ish years, actually, scarily, working in learning and development, and more recently specialising in wellbeing. Just became very important for me, and it's a subject I'm extremely passionate about. And I love working with leaders to help them understand around their well-being, any changes they might want to make and what are their kind of barriers, blockers to that, but also thinking about their teams and how can they support their team's well-being as well.
So. Yeah, and what I'm really looking forward to getting into today, and we hear a lot about it, is okay. We know that we need to have more well-being conversations on a day-to-day. You know, a lot of initiatives maybe haven't gone as well in terms of engagement. You know, employee value. You know, kind of EAP, kind of employee assistance programs and things like that haven't gone as well as maybe what we'd hoped, and so. Maybe it's kind of how do we bring everyday conversations and how are we balancing it with performance as well. And I think you have a really unique perspective on how do we actually help leaders and managers have those conversations and unpick those blockers. So I'm really keen to get into that. There was some really interesting stat, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it actually, just before we kind of kick off. But it's this stat that I'm going to put up, which mentions of burnout in employee reviews are up apparently 128%. But since April 2021, like that stat wouldn't surprise me if it was 2020, but April 2021, that seems quite big.
Yes, yeah. That's it is surprising, isn't it? Because you kind of think, well, what was happening in April? And we were kind of coming out of lockdown, weren't we? And looking a bit more hopefully towards the summer and all that kind of thing. So yeah, an interesting statistic. And I suppose my first thought is, I think everybody's a bit done with the whole pandemic. And I guess it's just built up, isn't it? When you think about burnout, that's exactly what happens. You know, people, you keep going, you keep striving, you keep trying to make new decisions, think about how we can work differently. You know, all of that has been at such a pace, I guess, from April for a year. So that's a long time, isn't it, to be working differently, working from home, trying to balance everything and just the pace of change along with other things that people have been experiencing. What's been going on with their family, those with children and in and out of school. It's just, I guess it's just added up, which is what happens in relation to burnout. And I think organisations have been doing as much as they can, but again, they're working at such a pace, they've got their own stuff going on. So as a leader, I think, yeah, the pace of work is different. Plus, you're trying to manage all of that for yourself and for your team. So, yeah, I guess in a way, once you talk that through, it's not surprising.
Yeah, you're right, and you know, we know it's been difficult for a lot of people. We also know that this is why it's so important that we're creating a bit of a more empathetic and kind of more. And we talked about a couple of weeks ago about, you know, making sure we switch that human element on and make sure it's a conscious effort to switch the human side on when we're at work, because of all these additional life events, as you mentioned, school and the worries and the concerns at home. This kind of work-life blend it's not. It's you are at work and in your life at the same time, and more than ever, it's blurred boundaries. So I guess in a way, it's not surprising. I guess you also made a really good point that burnout's become quite a hot topic word, and maybe that has something to do with it.
Yes, yeah, I think it seems to have replaced stress. It used to be stress was a huge word, wasn't it? And now, yeah, burnout does seem to be the kind of, I wouldn't call it a buzzword, but it's one of those things where as a leader, I suppose, if someone's talking to you about burnout, it's kind of, yeah, really getting under the skin about what does that individual mean? Because burnout's being defined, I guess, by various people, but it's always so individual. Yeah. And yeah, what does it mean for that individual, and what can their leader do to support them with it? And I suppose that straight away just brings me to whatever you want to call it, whether it's a wellness action plan, again, is something that a lot of people I know have tried to implement. But it's really just that individual thinking about, okay, what is going on for me, and what can help me? What can I do for myself to kind of try and limit that burnout and that feeling of whatever it is, whether it's overwhelm or exhaustion or anxiety. So what can I do to make myself feel better and take care of myself, but actually also thinking about what can my manager do to support me in that, and really trying to take control of that conversation. And then as a manager, being really open to listening to what's going on, because the easiest thing to do is, certainly if you've experienced it or you've got stuff going on, is to start instantly going, oh my God, yeah, I feel like that. And that's happening to me. But then it becomes about you as opposed to about that person that's trying to share what it is that's, that's concerning them and what they want to do to try and basically continue to be performing at work. That's what everybody wants to do. Yeah. I don't think there's, it's very rare that somebody doesn't want to perform at work, but it's being able to have that human conversation about, actually, this is what's going on for me. And this is what I'd really like from you to support me with that.
Yeah, and we've seen a bit of a shift, I think, just from the conversations that I've had, where the expectation on managers has been in the past kind of more of a connector. So it's like, here's signposting that can happen. So let's help you towards this employee assistance program. Let's help you towards this learning event or this yoga session or this something that's happening externally. Because I don't know quite how to help and have this more meaningful conversation around well-being. Because as you said, it's also very easy to go, oh yeah, me too. Or the other way around, which is kind of a bit more, oh, that must be really tough and that's really hard. And that's, which is crossing the line, I guess, between compassion and empathy. I've always been quite fascinated by that line, being sympathetic and being empathetic are two very different skills and very different things. And I think we're needing to move more towards the empathetic rather than the signposting connection. But how do people do it? And what is a great wellbeing action plan conversation on a one-to-one basis with your manager look like? And how do you create that environment, I suppose?
Yeah, which is challenging, and particularly for a manager where they could have, I'm thinking about, hospitality, for example. I'm thinking about my background as a restaurant manager, you could have 30 people that want to have that conversation with you on a regular basis. And that's a tough thing to manage. And also you've got that thing going on as a manager, haven't you, about, I've got somebody here who wants to talk to me about their well-being, but I actually also need them to be performing at work. So, and you've got all of that going on in your head at the same time. So I think businesses that have implemented, whether it's mental health first aiders, champions, whatever you want to call it, allies, so that there's somebody else that people can talk to as well, I think is really important, because you've got to have a pretty good relationship, I think, with your manager to be able to have some of those conversations. And you're also naturally going to be concerned about, what are they going to think about me and my ability to perform in my role if I'm really open. And that, I think, is part of a role of a manager, to kind of set that to one side and have a human conversation about, this is someone in front of me that's struggling at the moment. And actually, as a human, as a friend, what can I do? And the best thing that you can do is actually to listen and to ask them what they need, what's going to be most helpful. Because I love the way that you mentioned a yoga class, which I love yoga, and it's really helpful to me. It's one of the things that I personally use to maintain my well-being and my health. But actually just sending somebody to a yoga class is not going to be the answer, because what they're looking for from their manager, if they've had the courage to talk to their manager about this stuff, what they want to see, exactly what you're saying, Ant, is just some empathy and some consideration to, wow, okay, let's talk about what we can do about this and how I can support you. As opposed to, signposting, great, but if you just send me off to a yoga class, that suggests that you've not really heard what I've been saying.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you could apply that actually to a lot of things. You think about first really deeply listening and understanding, so that you can more effectively signpost. The yoga session might be part of a really good solution. It won't be the only part of that solution, though. And I think the first step, I suppose, what you're saying is the first step is to just deeply listen, set aside performance for a second, and just really switch on that human side and really deeply listen and understand that experience that someone's going through. One of the things I found really fascinating, and obviously there's been a lot of talk on LinkedIn about a lot of these different topics, but that every human's experience has been very different. And actually there's a lot to learn. There's a lot to really deeply understand about someone else's experience in your team. Almost use it as like the mindset that I would go into those, or try to go into with those conversations, is a real learning mindset. Can I learn something new about you and your life and your world that will help me think a little bit differently? Because I don't necessarily fully understand what you're going through. And when you're telling me burnout, it might be something completely different to how I would experience burnout, how someone else has dealt with burnout before.
Yeah, absolutely. And the word that springs to mind to me is about being curious, being really curious about what's going on. With that person. And you mentioned team there, Ant, as well. And of course, I'm talking about managers, but your team around you is so important. So it doesn't have to be your manager that you talk to. Of course, it can be anyone within your team who hopefully is just there to listen. And perhaps sometimes you just need to have a bit of a rant and a bit of an offload, don't you? That perhaps you can't do at home at the moment for whatever reason, or usually you might do that with friends, but when you're with colleagues all day, I say with, whether that be virtually or physically with, just a cuppa, because that's gone as well, isn't it? For a lot of people that are working virtually, you just don't get that chance to just sit and have a cup of tea anymore. You have to make an appointment to have a coffee with someone.
We've just we had a team kind of gathering on Tuesday, Wednesday. Feels like a very long week, but it was really good. Actually, it was an opportunity to go, how can we just improve our experience at work, and new team, new people. What do you think? What's helped you in the past? And one of the things is take 5 or take 10. Which is we're here in the office, so just making sure we get outside for 10 minutes, 5 minutes, but making sure that it's maybe with someone else, just to be curious about what's happening in their world and their life, and having a conversation, and just taking that time. And I guess one of the important things there is you're not talking about work or performance or a project, so you're just taking the time to listen and understand, and it's important.
And to connect is the word that's coming to me. Part of being human is we need that social connection. That's part of what helps us thrive, isn't it? Always, even if you go right back to the beginning of human nature, human life, it's always very social, and that's what we've lacked, isn't it, for the last 18 months. And actually, personally, I found it quite hard. When we first came out of lockdown, it just happened to be the first Saturday, I think, when we could have friends around in the garden. It happened to be my birthday. And I had about, I think, on and off throughout the day, probably was about 30 people, which I think was the limit, if I remember rightly. And it was exhausting, because you've just not been with that many people for ages. And I'm thinking about people going back to the offices at the moment, and just having that whole being with people on a tube or on a train that you haven't been used to. and then just having to socialize all day as well as trying to do your work. That in itself is exhausting. Yes, it's just, that's all adding up, isn't it? And I think there's also at the moment, I guess this week, I know, and I said to you yesterday, I'm avoiding the news because there's just a lot going on at the moment about what's going to happen in the winter and things, isn't it? And that must be in people's minds as well about, gosh, can we do this again? And what does that mean? So it's that constantly having to second guess, and I suppose it's making me think about mindfulness, and I practice mindfulness and trying to remain therefore in the present and try not to get too carried away with what ifs. And this could happen. What if I do this? It's difficult in business, I know, because you have to have those contingencies. But also just trying to remain present and go, okay, well, we don't know what's going to happen yet, so let's not worry about that. Let's just, stay where we are and try and focus on what's going on today.
That's a really interesting, like you say, almost the thing to do to look after your well-being is to focus on the present moment and to think about what you can control right now. We know that's a really effective tool. As a leader, as a leader of an organization, your duty to the organization and the safety of everyone else and the future success and growth and performance of that organization, you have to look forward. So how are you balancing that, I suppose? How are you making sure you have the time to be mindful and present and have those really conscious downtime moments where you're only thinking about what's happening now, and then also making sure that you are maybe planning for the things that may come up and doing and spending time balancing both? I suppose that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, it's tough, isn't it? It's quite a burden, as you say. And I'm thinking again for colleagues that I know of and friends that I know of in HR, that's been their ongoing challenge as well, hasn't it, for the last 18 months? That real concern for looking after their employees and, but also having to try and second guess, okay, what if this happens, what we're going to do? If that happens, what we're going to do and stuff. And I think I've spoken to quite a lot of HR people who are really, really exhausted, kind of done, because they're in a position like all leaders are of not only thinking about themselves, obviously, but also thinking about a huge amount of other people in the mix and their level of responsibility that they have for that.
Yeah, responsibility was the word that was flying around my head when you said that. It was, that's a huge responsibility. That's a huge weight. And it's almost therefore more important to make sure you are having those downtime moments. Also, you mentioned 3 kind of places, I suppose, or ways to connect with others. So you talked about champions or allies of wellbeing, mental health first aid being available and accessible. You've talked about your manager or your leader or the people that are around you who have that position around you. You may have a dotted line. It may be more of a matrix organization, so it may not be a direct leader, but it's someone that you can speak to. And then it's the people that you work with, either in a project team, bid team, whatever team that you work with, and you might work with multiple teams or across teams. It's the people around you that you interact with in every meeting, in all of those little interactions. It's how you connect and communicate with those 3 key people, I suppose, that will help you find that balance.
Yeah, I think so. And I think what's been great as well during the pandemic is the amount of conversations that people have been having about their well-being. It's one of my, I think, frustrations or something that I wanted to hear more of was people talking about physical and mental health in the same sentence. And actually that is now happening. So that's a real plus, I think, in the fact that people are recognizing that it is important. Mental health is important. And the amount of people that are now talking about what they're struggling with and what they live with, I think is great, because people have now a more general understanding of some of these illnesses or issues that people experience. So I think that is a real positive that we should. And actually, we touched on earlier, I said to you, I've spoken to a lot of people that, we're waiting for the clocks to change and it's darker mornings at the moment. And we're, a lot of us are feeling a bit like, oh, winter's coming and all of that. And of course, seasonal affective disorder, which we kind of think, oh, it's winter blues, and you can kind of brush it off. And for most of us, we're fortunate, I think, where our body clock adjusts. So it's just that time at the moment of kind of a few weeks where you're getting used to the fact that, the nights are drawing in and whatever. But for some people, of course, it's a serious, illness that they live with every year and they experience every year, and can be quite immobilizing for some. So again, I guess I'm thinking about, if someone does talk to you about, about SAD, to kind of take it seriously, and again, to have that conversation about what does that mean for you, to try and manage that, and what again can I do to support you with that, rather than just, I think sometimes there's still a stigma attached to it, and people could just brush it off and just go, okay, well, we all go through that. None of us like the dark mornings. Well, for some it's, not wanting to get out of bed kind of.
I definitely struggle, and I'd class myself as a morning person, and I really struggle with that time. I'm just saying to you, wasn't I, just before we hopped on, I've got a Lumi light recently, because it's really difficult, and there are obviously other lights available that do the similar sort of thing, but but it's really, really helped me, and it just helps you feel fresher in the morning. But again, I guess it comes back to what your point was: just be curious, switch the human on, be curious, and have that conversation. I guess one of the things that goes around my mind, because we do a lot of work with wellbeing champions, wellbeing coaching, wellbeing conversations, and helping people upskill the organization in having more meaningful conversations. One of the questions that we always get is, how do you overcome the blockers, or what are those blockers to having a really meaningful, curious conversation? Like, what are some of the things that get in the way of us being curious and switching that human on, even if we do have those skills?
Yes, I'm thinking there's a couple that spring to mind. Just hope I can remember them as I'm talking. I think one is, particularly I think for managers, is if someone comes and talks to me about this, they're expecting me to fix it, which of course they're not. Usually they're not. They might be looking for help and some support, but then certainly not requiring their manager to fix it for them. And I think actually that's a trap that managers can fall into. Let me suggest what you can do. Let me tell you what you can do. But actually that's totally disempowers that individual, and leads to that, I think, adds to that thought of, if I talk to my manager about this, they're going to think that I can't do my job. So if the manager then tries to fix it for them, that's absolutely taking away that power of, like, actually, no, I am capable of fixing this for myself. I just want to talk to you about it and perhaps work it through together. So that's one thing I think that worries managers, that they've got to fix the problem. I think the other thing in relation to mental health in particular is there's still a little bit of concern and stigma that actually talking about it's going to make it worse. But of course, we know it's the complete opposite. So the more that somebody can talk it through, whether it's around, if someone's anxious, for example, about something, you talking to them about it is not going to make it worse. It's only going to make it better. So I think there's that fear. Trying to think of other barriers. Of course, some people just struggle more with these kind of human conversations than others. It's just not something they're used to. It's not something perhaps they've had as they've grown up in life. So there's a kind of a wall there, because they don't like to show their own vulnerability, perhaps. So therefore, if someone is showing vulnerability, they just emotionally just can't handle it. And that's not their fault or anything, but that's a hard thing to learn suddenly as a manager, And I guess also there was always this old thing, wasn't there, about, if you're at work, you're at work, and you bring your work self to work, So it's breaking down those barriers about, and I think that's also probably a positive of the last 18 months, is that because work has become home, you can't now have that different personality of that's me in work and that's me at home. It's all kind of blended. So I think people have learned an awful lot about each other, because we've had to, because, you've had your kids running around in the background, or coming in, or whatever it is that's happening. So I do completely empathise with managers who are dealing with this, and when it doesn't come naturally to them, they're not quite sure what to do. So skills development actually is so important. And again, a lot of businesses have done the awareness part of let's help people understand what mental health, for example, is all about. But if they haven't had the opportunity to really talk it through, to learn some skills on how to really, really effectively listen, get curious, all of that, then that's tough.
It's really interesting because what you kind of alluded to, what I was thinking as you were saying, is the self-awareness, the importance of self-awareness for a manager, for a leader, to know whether this is something that actually they don't feel comfortable with, and that's okay as well.
Yeah.
You know, you don't have to be fixing everything, and it's not you may feel the responsibility as a leader and as a manager, and sometimes you're not going to know what the answer is, and that's okay. And kind of playing that coaching role, or that kind of tell me more, be curious. Sometimes that's all the other person is needing from you, and I guess that kind of takes the responsibility and the weight off of that person who might not find it necessarily as easy to have some of those conversations.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think if someone is in that situation, thinks, just be honest and just say, you know what, I really want to help you, but I'm actually not quite sure what we can do with this. So let's go and get some help from elsewhere. Yeah, let's bring someone else in, whether that be HR or an ally or just someone else in the team or whatever. Asking that individual permission, of course, to bring someone else into the equation. But yeah, just be upfront, because that's the best thing that you can do if you don't feel equipped.
That's brilliant. Actually, if you actually run that through in your mind, anyone that's listening that might struggle with that type of conversation, if you run that kind of image in your mind, someone comes to you, they're struggling with burnout, you know, they look tired, they've plucked up the courage. Let's face it, it's actually quite a courageous thing to come to someone who is responsible for the performance of you and for measuring you. That's quite a courageous, potentially a conversation, if you haven't got that psychological safety that we talk about in that environment. And they've come to you and they've gone, I'm really struggling, I'm burning out. And for you to go, I'm going to be really honest, I'm not sure I can help, but let's sit down and let's think about this together. Let's work through this together. Come on, let's have a cup of tea. Whether that's face to face, let's sit here or sit in a coffee shop, or whether that's on Zoom, and you're just making sure that you have those minutes to connect and to be curious.
Yeah, that's the most important thing. And I think you're right, Ant, just acknowledging and stopping, because you could be I'm thinking again about restaurants. You know, this could happen on the restaurant floor while you're running a busy shift, you know, and someone says to me, I need to talk to you. I'm like, yeah. And just having to pause and acknowledge the fact that, okay, somebody's had the courage to come and talk to me about this. I owe them a couple of minutes of my time. Even if I don't know what I can do to help, I just need to acknowledge, that I care. That's the most important thing. Yeah.
It's a really good point, though, and I've certainly felt some of these experiences before, you know, where someone comes to you and you go, I'm about to jump onto a call, or I'm just about to do something else, or I've got a million and other, but it is your responsibility, right? It's again, you've got to take into account their courage, but there's a practical and a logistical thing here that you might not be able to give them minutes in that moment. What do you do? What do you do? What happens then?
Again, I think you have to be honest, don't you? You have to say, you know, I genuinely care, and thanks so much for talking. You know, can you just give me 5 minutes and I'll be there? I think, you're right, because it is your responsibility. So you do need to take that time. It's your duty of care, particularly if someone has come to you and said, I need to talk to you. But yeah, if it can't happen in the moment, I think you've just got to be honest and say, you know, give me 5 minutes, I'll be with you. Or whatever.
We talked last week about, and that's what's coming back to me. We talked last week about making sure you make the most of the second moment. Not everyone's going to be able to have the first perfect moment. And we were talking last week, you know, whether it's a perfect performance conversation or a conversation that didn't quite go the way that you wanted it to go. Make sure you intentionally catch the second moment. I suppose what you've said here is, even if you can't help in that moment, damn well make sure that you can help in a few minutes, hour, or what have you, but communicate it. You know, whether it's on Teams or Zoom, you know, look in someone's eyes and connect so they know that you care. Switch that human intentionally on, and then communicate it and move forward. That's a really that's something I'll take away from this conversation for sure. That's really
Love
interesting.
It's
I'm
just conscious Sally's asked a question. Sally's been very vocal, thank you. She's asked a question about, I know we've got to go. A mental health conversation is becoming more or less now. People feel things are getting back to normal.
I think that's a really good point, Sally, and thank you for joining us. I can't believe it's gone so quickly already, and we say that every time, and it always shocks me. It never should, because every week I say the same thing. Thank you for joining. It's been really great having you on.
Thanks, Ant. Yeah, great conversation. Yeah, and I hope it's helped a few people. That's the aim, isn't it?
That's why we do what we do, isn't it? Thank you for anyone who's listening live or the recording that's on YouTube. Thank you for joining us. Friday live every 8:30. That's what we do. So look forward to seeing you next week, Friday 8:30. Thank you, Alison, again, and I'll see you soon.
Yeah, thanks, Ant. Bye, everyone.